Good evening, my dear friends. I hope you're all doing very well. Tonight we're going to be learning chapter 13 in the laws of Shabbat. And we're going to be learning all about the laws of transferring from one domain to another. So we're going to be continuing essentially what we started discussing yesterday of this concept that on Shabbat we're not allowed to take an object from one place and put it into another place. One domain to another domain. From a private property to a public property, from one public property to another public property, etc. So, as we said yesterday, that a person is only going to be liable on transferring something from one domain to another if they actually lift up the item, move it across to the other domain, and put it down over there. So, that is all applicable in a case where a person picks it up from a surface that is larger than about a foot by a foot, 4 handbreadths, which comes out to about, I would say about 15 inches by 15 inches. That's how big the platform of space, of solid space, has to be. But if, for instance, it's sitting on a pole, which is smaller than that size, and it's just something which is sitting on it, and the person picks it up and moves it and puts it down on the other domain, so then they would not be liable. Or, for instance, we're going to be discussing it soon and later on in the chapter, if a person picks up something that is floating on water, which is not counted as a solid domain, so then they wouldn't be liable. Although it's not allowed to be done, but they would not be liable. Now, what about the hand of a person? If I pick up something from someone else's hand, is that person's hand counted as an actual platform, even though it's smaller than 15 by 15 inches? So the Rambam says that a person's body is going to be part of the considered as a platform of a place which is the right size of 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths. So therefore, if a person picks up something from a person that's standing in a public domain, let's say. So if I stick my hand out of my house or of my property and I pick up something from someone else's hand and I pull it into my house and I put it down, so then I would be liable because it is counted as if it is sitting on a solid surface. Now what about if a person has something in their mouth? So their mouth is not their hand, but they are eating. And they want this food to be in their mouth, so it is, they purposely have it in their mouth, so then it's counted that it is sitting on a solid platform and they would be liable. Unless, and this is the concept that we mentioned yesterday, if someone moves something in a weird manner, in an uncommon way, so then they are not liable, because in an abnormal fashion a person would not be liable, because the Torah says that you have to do the action in a regular, normal way. So if a person wants to transfer something by placing it in their mouth, to place a key or a pen or something in their mouth, so then that's weird, so then they would not be liable in such a case. But on that same note, if a person is standing in their property and spits into another property, they would be liable because that's the normal way of spitting, comes from your mouth. And so that's an interesting thing. Unless the person's head is actually outside their house on the public property, so then you didn't actually transfer from one property to another because your face and your mouth is already outside. So then that's going to be different. Okay. What happens in the case of water? As we mentioned earlier, we said that water is not considered as a platform of a solid surface, which if you were to pick something up from it, even if there is, let's say, if there is a stream of water and there is a box or a container that has some fruit in it floating down the stream, and you pick something up from the water and you put it down somewhere else, so then you would not be liable because water is not considered as a surface which is counted as a complete surface. But, and here comes the interesting idea which the Rambam says, if you have a pit full of water and you take some water from it, or something which is sitting on the water, so then you would be liable. Because since this water is sitting in a confined space, in a pit full of water, so then it's considered that the water is sitting on the ground, and therefore it's sitting on something which is solid. So that's an interesting idea. So as mentioned, that a person is only going to be liable if they literally pick it up and they put it down in another property. But if I am standing, for instance, and I'm holding something, and someone places something within my hand, so it's an interesting thing because they are lifting something in one property and they are putting it down into my hand, so they have actually also put it down. So then they would still be liable. But if I take it from their hand, it's going to be different because then they only do half. They only lift it, stick it out, and I pull it out of their hands. So then none of them would be liable. Not me nor him, because we each have only done a half of the transfer. All of this, when does this apply? In a case when the giver's hand, so let's say if I'm standing and I'm sending my arm out of my property and I wanted to give it to someone else to take out of my hand. But if my hand is within 3 hand breadths, which is about a foot on average, to the ground, so then it is considered, it's equivalent as if it is placed on the ground. Because at that level, once something comes within that space to the ground, it is considered as if it is on the ground already. And that's an important thing to note. We're going to be mentioning this concept throughout these laws a little bit. So it's important to note that something which is within 3 hand breadths to the ground, so a hand breadth is this much, is 1 hand breadth. So 3 hand breadths. If it is within 3 hand breadths in the height to the ground, so then it is considered as if it's on the ground. So even if you push your hand out of your property, but if it's low enough to be over within that space to the ground, even if someone else pulls it out of your hand, still you would be liable because you have taken it from one place, sent it to the other property, and now because it's so close to the ground, it's as if you also put it down on the ground. All right. The Rambam continues over here in discussing these laws, which I would agree are a little bit complicated. But he moves on to discuss an interesting situation. If a person lifted up something in their property, so I'm at home and I have my pen and I lift it, and now I walk out of my house. Problem is, I didn't realize that I'm holding my pen. Maybe it's in my pocket or whatever. And then I'm walking, I'm taking a stroll, and I realize in the middle of my walk that it is Shabbat, and I am holding a pen. If I turn around and I go back home without stopping, I would not be liable. For a very interesting reason, because as we said, a person has to lift up something in one domain, go into the other domain, and put it down in that domain. But if you never actually put it down into the other domain, you're not liable. So if I lift a pen and I walk out of my house, and then I never stop, and I keep on walking with it, and I come back home and I put it back down in my house, it's as if it never left. So although obviously a person shouldn't do this, and this is not allowed to be done, but if a person, by mistake did it, so then they would not be liable. And even if let's say it's something which is heavy, and they stopped for a moment just to fix it on their shoulder, as they're walking back home, still they will not be liable because it's still part of the walking, unless they stop to take a rest. It's a different story. But in such a case, they would not be liable. This is a very important derivative. Something which comes out of this is because this actually happened to me once. I was once walking and I realized that I had my keys in my pocket on Shabbat. So I just turned around and went back and put it right back down into my house. Because if you don't actually put it down, so then you're fine. Now, this is an interesting case. Along these same lines, if a person is walking and it's Friday afternoon, and you have something on, you're carrying a load, and suddenly comes Shabbat, and you're walking with your item. Now, Shabbat is starting. You haven't lifted this up on Shabbat. You lifted up before Shabbat began. So you've never lifted this item on Shabbat. You're already walking with it. So the Rambam says you should run. Run with your item in order to make sure that you remember that you shouldn't stop and take it home. And then when you get home, you should throw it into the house in an abnormal manner, because at the end of the day, you're transferring from one domain to another. You've started outside, you've started in the public domain, and you've come to a private domain. So you should run home in order to make sure they don't stop. And you shouldn't actually be lifting this item because you've already lifted it from before Shabbat. And so that your lifting is not counted. Run home, and when you get home, throw it in an abnormal manner so that you shouldn't be liable. Because if you transfer them in an abnormal manner, so then you're fine. Especially since you haven't actually lifted this item. So then this person hasn't actually transgressed anything on Shabbat. So this is a very, I guess, is a very practical law in something that can happen. If you're walking and it's Friday afternoon, you suddenly realize that you have something in your pocket. Just keep on walking all the way till you get home and throw it in once you get home. But you have to make sure they don't stop, so you have to run. So when a person is removing something from one place, and he only takes it for less than 4 amot, less than 4 cubits. So, as we said yesterday, a person is only going to be liable if they move something outdoors in a public property more than 4 cubits. So, as we said, it's the width of a person stretching out their hand. So it's about 5 feet probably, just about. So if a person takes something and lifts it in a public property, and now walks with it just a little bit, and then puts it down, and then again lifts it up, starts going, puts it down. In essence, doesn't actually have to put it down. Just the mere fact of walking is as if you lifted it, and now you're walking with it, and then when you stop, it's as if you put it down. So every time you do this, and if you keep on stopping, so then essentially, you're not going to be transgressing Shabbat, because you're lifting it in one place, you're putting it down within 4 cubits of where you picked it up, and you keep on doing this, you can actually go a long way with it. Obviously, this is not something which we should do. But technically speaking, if a person has done this, even if they've walked the whole day like this, walk 2 steps, stop, walk 2 steps, stop, walk 2 steps, stop, they're not going to be liable for this. Same idea is if you have something, let's say maybe like a spear or a long stick, which is on the ground, and you lift up one end of it, and you push it over. But the other end of it was still on the ground. and then you continue. You take the next end, and you flip it over itself, and you keep on moving it like this. But there's always one part of the article is on the ground. The person wouldn't be liable. Differently, in contrast, to a case where a person drags something on the ground, which is as if it's rolling on the ground. In such a case, the person would be. So in other words, something which is rolling or is being pulled or pushed on the ground is one thing. Over there, they would be liable. But if something is just moved while it's still on the ground, it's a long stick, and you pick up one end and the other end is still on the ground, and you just flip it over, so then they would not be liable. So now comes an interesting set of laws over here in the same idea of moving something from one domain to another. The Rambam discusses what happens in a case where a person throws an item. So a person throws an item from one domain to another domain. So the Rambam says like this: throwing an item is the same as moving it yourself. If you take something and you put it down, or you throw it and it lands, it's the same thing. But what happens if you throw something from your house outside, or from your property to another property, and now, before it lands, it got burnt? Poof, fire came and ate it. Or a dog came and bit it, caught it. So now the person is not going to be liable because it didn't actually land. This is not the type of landing that he was planning on. So too also, if a person throws something from their property to the public property, and it's connected with a string. So essentially, it didn't actually land. Because even though it's landed over there, but since it has a string and you're able to pull it back in, so it's not a complete placing. It's not a complete landing. So therefore, the person would not be liable. Same idea. If a person throws something and their friend catches it. So if your friend is standing there just like this, and poof, in comes the baseball into their mitt, well, they would be liable. The person who threw it would be liable because you didn't actually do anything. You're just standing there and it falls right in. But if the other person ran to go and catch it, so then neither of them will be liable because he threw it, and the other person caught it in the air. So that person picked it up. I threw it. None of us did a complete, actual removing of a property. So this is an interesting thing. Taking something from one private domain to another private domain. Although it's not allowed on Shabbat, a person is not liable in the same way. This prohibition of moving something from one domain to another domain is either from a private property to a public property, or vice versa, or from or within the public domain on the road, from one place to another place. But if we take something from one private property, from my house to my neighbor's house, you're not liable in the same way. So what happens if a person throws it across the street? I take it from my house, I throw it over the street, and it lands into my neighbor, but it's across the street. So it has flown through the space of the public domain, but it didn't actually land there. So as long as it's over 10 cubits off the ground, as long as it's 3 cubits, about a foot higher above the ground, so then I would not be liable. But if it landed within the public domain and then it continued rolling into the other person's property, so then it's counted as if it landed in the public domain. and therefore I would be liable. So to also, what we're not allowed to do on Shabbat is if we stick our hand from one private domain, and we stick our hands literally over. If there's a little alleyway going between the two houses, and I stick my hand across into my friend's house, and I place it down in his house, so then that is something which is not allowed to be done, because this is actually what they were doing during the building of the tabernacle. This specific action. So therefore, a person would be liable for this, because what happened was, at the time of the temple, the miniature temple, they would take it apart and they would use it when they were traveling. So what happened was that they had these big wagons where they would put all the articles of the tabernacle, of this miniature temple, and then they would transfer things from one wagon to another wagon. So every wagon was essentially a private domain. But between the wagons was a public domain. And if they stuck their hands over from one wagon to another and passed something over, so that's exactly the same action as taking something from one house over the public domain and placing it into another private house. So then in such a case, a person would be liable. As we said before, a person who does something on Shabbat, it has to be that what they wanted to, what they were planning on doing actually happened. So if a person wanted to throw something to a certain place and it landed there, so then they're going to be liable. But if a person wanted to throw something within 4 cubits, so that would be allowed technically, because it's within your box of space, as we spoke. But then it actually rolled out of the space and it went further than just the 4. It went more than you planned on. It was too strong. You threw it too strong. So then a person would not be liable because it wasn't according to their plan of what was supposed to happen. If a person just threw it without thinking and it landed within their 4 cubits, within their immediate space, but then it rolled out further, so they would still not be liable. But if it landed outside of their 4 cubits and then it rolled back in, so what happens in such a case? So if they threw it and it went further than their 4 cubits, further than the 4 handbreadths, than this 5 feet space which is around the person, which within that space there is allowed, but they threw it further than that, and then it rolled back in. So if it didn't bounce off anything, so then they would not be liable. But if it did, then they would be. So my friends, I would agree with you that these are very complicated laws. As I mentioned a few times, that the laws of Shabbat are pretty complicated. But we are making headway. And we are getting there. We're almost halfway through them. So it's quite impressive. Keep it up. I hope you're understanding what's going on. Although they are quite complex, I'm trying my best to explain them as best as I can. We will see you all tomorrow. And I hope you're all doing very well. All the best.